Today is the 5th day of the August 86 retreat. Before we get into our main topics, I want to say a few things about what somebody brought up in regard to eating in a hurry. There's no need to eat in a hurry. We all used to eat much faster and rush without knowing why we had to rush. But there's no need for that. There's enough time after each meal to do the jobs that need to be done and get done with them before another sitting starts. One may already hear the clatter of dishes. Somebody may wish to start early with the job of washing dishes. It's his or her own affair. Let us not let the sound of dishwashing hurry us into gulping down the food. Or that at a certain time work begins. It's true, we have to keep to a certain schedule to have an orderly functioning of this retreat, but there's enough time to eat at leisure. And it's for each one of us to find this leisure and be aware what of the pressure to get done is supplied from the outside and what from the inside, from past programs. It's a terrible thing to gulp down food just in order to get done and do the work. It's not good for the organism at all. And in that there's no awareness that we were talking about of this whole process of eating. We've had in a previous hot retreat the experience that some of the leftovers later on got sour, so maybe leftover people need to do this, but this is not even the case now. It's not hot. So regardless of what someone else may be doing, somebody else hurrying to get their food, hurrying to get seconds, hurrying to get to the job, let that be each of our own thing, keeping in mind the overall order of the retreat. Looking at the schedule, how much time there is before another sitting starts, etc. One person asked, isn't the self necessary to survive? Would we survive without the self? To intelligently discuss a question like this, we all must be clear what we mean by survival. and what we mean by the self. Survival means, doesn't it, to live healthily. A certain life expectancy. Sanely. Not with severe mental dysfunction, although one can survive with severe mental dysfunction, so maybe this is not to be included in survival. Bare survival is the organism lives on for a while until it comes to an end, either through sickness or an accident or old age. The organism living on, for which is needed food, protection against the extremes of weather, cold or heat, a place to live, although there are people who are surviving without having a place to live. Some people in this country live on benches and in stations without a roof over their head, and certainly so in other countries. So a shelter, a house is not absolutely necessary for survival. One can survive for a while without proper food, but then something happens to the organism. Gets feeble or sick, eventually dies if there's not the right food or no food. So to really survive, very little is needed. And yet, of that, the right kind, the right food, the proper temperature, right clothing, within margins, depending also on the constitution of each person. Some people have a much tougher constitution than others. One can get used to a lot, the body can make adjustments to quite a bit of deprivation. Here in our Western culture, by survival we mean earning a living so that one can live the way one would like to live, with a family or alone, but with a proper place to live. Clothes, a car. See how difficult it gets? I know several people who would rather walk or ride a bike than buy a car, so as not to add to environmental pollution, because that contributes to the toxification of the atmosphere and therefore to sickness of living things. So for one's body or the organism to live healthily, we need certain things. Where does the self come in? And what is the self? If one says, don't we need a self to survive? does one mean by that self an ongoing functional intelligence to see what is needed and to provide for that? I wouldn't call that the self. It's just understanding the needs of the organism by being aware of what leads to what foods leads to what feelings or symptoms, what intake, let's put it this way, leads to what consequences. Rest. Intelligently aware of what is needed to function optimally. Exercise, we didn't mention this. Does one need exercise to survive? Many people, now exercise is more in vogue. Many people didn't used to exercise at all. And some of them lived into their 80s. But regardless of what other people can do or have done, what is necessary for this organism to function optimally? For that we can read books to get ideas, but one needs to observe very carefully and without being influenced by these books, which is very difficult. Books are bestsellers because they do influence. I mean, certain health books are books that bring out new diets all the time. Very convincing. When one reads a book like this and one is ready to go out, throw all the food out that one has bought and get new stuff until the next book comes out. Particularly if one has no scientific way of testing what is being said and so forth. So can one find out for oneself intelligently what helps optimal functioning, what food, what rest, what exercise, what intake or absence of intake, which includes not just intake through the mouth, but through all the senses, the ears, eyes, nose, skin, which requires sensitivity. Which very often we don't have because we have already abused this organism with not so good food or wrong food, not good exercise or no exercise, not enough rest, and too much sensory input. With this, the body, the organism becomes dull and insensitive, requiring more stimulation or more input. One can at any time begin to observe this whole process. You could say, well, how can I observe it if I'm numb and dull? I don't know how. One has to start looking, feeling. Not just cut out one fragment of one's life for observation, but observe over a long time. What leads to what? All of this, what has been described so far, is the function of sensitivity, intelligence. Intelligence meaning being free to look at data, being free to look at what happens, and seeing the connections and changing what one finds is not helpful. Where does the self come in? What is the self? Is it an idea we have that we have a self that takes care of ourselves and that we need, that has taken care of ourselves and will do so in the future? Is it just idea to which one clings? Maybe stemming from psychological theory that one is familiar with. A manner of talking and then dreading this talk of no self or self being unnecessary, and therefore arguing internally or externally in favor of the self on this basis of idea. That can be entertaining or energy arousing, such argument, but it has no basis in fact. It has its basis in idea, in theory. And then to argue that the self is necessary for survival is a theoretical assertion. If one doesn't really know actually, factually, what one means when one says the self, based on one's own observation and insight. What we're calling the self here is the accumulation of all of our ideas about ourself, which are based in memory of our past experiences. What we have been told since we were tiny, what we are, what we should be, what we shouldn't be. What we have experienced as right by being rewarded, and therefore a way of behaving that has been rewarded, having become ingrained in the body-mind. A child that is rewarded for smiling may smile even when it doesn't feel like smiling. It smiles because it wants the reward either of a friendly parent or whatever the reward has been or could be. An obstinate child may have been told from the beginning, almost from the beginning, how obstinate it is. It has this little person has heard this from very early days, and the image is ingrained of being obstinate. Therefore, one lives up to this image of being obstinate, the idea of oneself being that. I'm just picking out one trait, but we have an accumulation of images about ourselves. And they change, we add to them, we drop some. All based on memory. This is not an assertion. It sounds like an assertion, but one can look at it for oneself. Because this instant of acting, of responding, if it doesn't come from memory, is not yet known. A moment later I may say, oh, interesting how I acted. I didn't know that trait of mine. And it becomes added to one's repertoire, if one is so inclined. Included in the self as we talk about it are all of one's fears and anxieties, which one has developed over the years, based on experience, also taken over by osmosis from one's parents. If one has a fearful parent, a child being so intimately in communion with a parent will take over this fear very easily, maybe not always. If a parent looks worried during a thunderstorm, a little child may pick it up and become worried about thunderstorms. Included in the self are all of our hopes, aspirations for the future, which we have picked up from past experience with our family, our school, our society, the books we've read. Included in the self is the very notion of becoming somebody or something. Not only of what one is, but what one can become. The idea of it as represented to us by our heroes and leaders, either from legend or from the contemporary scene, which is not so different from legend. Because how a leader really is who leads a country, how does one know? There are, well, I have to go. In addition to the personal image that one, or the collection of personal images one has about oneself, that one is timid or bold, aggressive or submissive. Do we see that we have these images? Or is one just listening to, like reading a book aloud? That one is shy, the image of that, and then living up to this image, the power of the image on our behavior. Power of having heard our parents say, oh, he's so outgoing, everybody likes him, and the child hears that. And his other brother, I don't know, he's so different. He's always sort of reticent and not like his brother. Parents, we as parents, we talk about our children and the children hear it. There's this amazing notion in parents that children don't hear what parents say because they're playing. I remember all the things my parents thought we didn't hear as children. So, in addition to the personal collection of images we have of ourselves, we have the image of the group that we belong to, the family, our family name, maybe a name of weight in society or in certain sector of society, or maybe of no weight at all. There's an identity to the name and also to the weight it carries. If it carries weight, that is included in our identity. If it doesn't carry any weight, that's also included in our identity. How our parents, our father is treated by others, whether respectfully, that's included in the child's identity. Or whether he is not treated respectfully, is also included in the child's identity. and then the church we may belong to, or temple. Religious affiliation is becomes our identity. I've talked ad infinitum about this, but very often it is not seen and understood. People sometimes think I'm beating a dead horse. I think this horse is very much alive. The identity of being a Christian, and within Christianity, I don't know if anybody has ever counted all the different Christian identities. They're on the wax. The identity of being a Catholic, of being a Jew, of being a Buddhist, a Muslim. And the weightiness of this, which we tend to dismiss if we are attached to this identity. Because being so attached, we don't want anything to rattle it, so we say, I'm very open to other religions. But that does not mean that this identity isn't there and is going to be defended at the moment of attack or danger. I personally had this experience with my son, which maybe I've told it once. There were people knocking on the door. They were religious proselytizers wanting to come in and give their talk. And I had fairly recently joined the Zen Center. Not too recently, I'd been there for a while. But long enough to have established this identity. And as these people were talking and trying to convince me of the truth of their religion and that it would be worthwhile to listen to a series of 6 lectures, some stamina came up. I can feel it now, how it came up. It arose because this had never been the case in my life before. I didn't have an identity. I had a very mixed identity before. Maybe I'll talk about that later. Maybe not. And in trying not just to get rid of them, but to just counter their zeal, I said, I don't know what else I said, but I know I said, I'm a Buddhist. With which the people were somewhat shocked and bid me farewell. Left, and I closed the door. And Ralph, who was at that time, he was 8 when I joined the center, so he must at least have been 10 or 11. He kept saying, I'm a Buddhist. Not just once, I'm a Buddhist. He didn't say it to me. It had struck him. That child heard something. He hadn't heard before from Mom. I'm a Buddhist. And I felt terrible. I felt something wrong had happened. But I didn't take time or was inclined to sort it out. And then another example, because I think Buddhists particularly, but also who in particular, Christians too feel they envelop the whole earth, and everybody will eventually come to their God. And Buddhists feel with the peacefulness of their religion, everybody is enveloped, everybody is enclosed, even the animals. And Christianity doesn't do that, doesn't include the animals. So one feels, what's wrong with this identity? Because I'm open I'm open to anybody becoming a Buddhist, of course, or a Christian, or a Muslim. But also, this hanging on the identity which is so often ignored or denied, particularly in Buddhism, because it is said that all is empty, so one can have one's cake and let it be empty. One can say, I am this, I have this figure, I do the ceremonies, but I'm doing it in emptiness. I'm empty of real attachment. And whether this is so or not cannot be found out unless it is put to a radical test. And at the time of leaving the Zen Center, there was a woman who had worked with me for years. We'd been friends and talked with each other long before any of this happened, even long before I did retreats there. A very close working relationship and friendship also. And at the time that I declared that I was leaving, she was in tears. She and her husband had been Jewish before becoming Buddhists. And now she said, I can't go with you, even though I would like to, but because I want to bring my children up as Buddhists. What does that mean? I want to bring my children up as Christians. I want to bring my children up as Muslims, as Jews. Do you see what it means? Not on the small scale for my little family where it's nice to have something to relate to tell the children, to give them security in, but on the global scale, where is their security in these identities? The same goes for national identity. The very thing that we're seeking security in is the very thing that sets man and woman against man and woman. In spite of all these ever-recurring attempts at brotherhood that have never worked. Because when the chips are down, when the pad is invaded, or the threat comes, one sticks to one's identity. It's been programmed. The wiring comes with building the house. And the lights flash when there's danger to the house. The house is filled with armament. Verbal or actual. So this is part of the self, the identity with the larger group, the attachment to the identity. Not just to one's personality traits, to one's talents, one's profession, what one's father is or one's relatives. But the attachment to the larger group in which one is something, a member of that group, with a name, maybe with a uniform. With songs that go with that group. Hymns or chants or national anthems. And let none of us underestimate the power of these early conditionings, how they infuse the whole organism. So, is this self, with its images, its identities, its fears, always in all attachment lurks the fear of losing that attachment, of being offended in that identity? And very often, a conflict of identities. The restlessness of being in conflict over different identities, I can't even think of an example, but being ruthless in business and yet an elder of the church. On the one hand, greed and competition being the sanctioned form of behavior. In the other group, lovingness, selflessness, no greed, being the sanctioned behavior, and the conflict of that, either felt and leading to dis-ease or else ignored, and therefore leading to indifference or even callousness. You could say, well, all the things you've listed about this self is all so negative, makes me so depressed. Self has its pleasures. I don't think I have to talk about them. One person said, what about the ice cream cone that I want? We all want ice cream cones at times. I don't think, though, that if we want an ice cream cone, that this leads to conflagration. This doesn't provide an identity. We may overeat on ice cream and be sick afterwards, or we may get fat on ice cream cones and don't like that identity of fatness. If one constantly craves ice cream cones, that's part of the self pattern, having to have something to feel good, just like anything else. But occasionally eating an ice cream cone, what's the problem? The question was, don't we need a self in order to survive? Survive as what? As a healthy organism. We talked about that in the beginning. Don't need a self for that. I think we can all agree on that. It needs the intelligence of observation and looking, and then also being able to act on that insight into what leads to proper functioning of this very precious instrument, which is our body. This human organism is an incredibly sensitive instrument. And just as we take care of precious instruments when we understand their value see that the care is needed for the instrument to continue functioning properly. So can one take the same care of this instrument, which is the body? Self comes in when one is attached to the body, worrying about everything that happens to it or could happen to it. There's a fine line between the intelligent observation and constant worry and concern over the body. Concern over getting sick when one isn't sick, getting old when one isn't old, or when one is getting old. Attachment to youth and the fright of getting old, which is part of the self. The organism does age, self or not. But to be attached to a certain stage in its evolving is self, is idea. Wanting it to be this way and dreading it to be that way. Attachment to image of youth. And with that attachment and with that worry, survival is not enhanced. On the contrary, a mind that is constantly worrying about itself, about the body getting older, runs in grooves. And there's nothing clear or healthy about running in a groove. The brain wears itself out over its worries. One can worry so much about becoming senile that the worry already is senility. So the intelligent care of the body, why does it have to be linked with attachment to this body, even though it is? It doesn't have to, but it is. Unless one begins to see and have insight into the what this attachment does. The fear that goes with it, the insecurity, the separation, the isolation in this box of worry about me and mine. It says, well, don't I need to find out what I can best do? Don't I need to find a job which I can thrive and enjoy doing? And isn't that selfish? See, one can be so hair-splitting on, is this selfish? Is this a good want? Is this a bad want? Observe it. To find something to do that one is capable of doing well, and that is enjoyable to do, that gives zest and energy. What could be wrong with that? And yet, if in what one is doing, one has to be the best one of all of those people who are doing it, and compete with others, try to get to the top, and that there is separation and alienation, isolation. There is the self wanting to be tops, wanting to excel, with which goes drain on the energies, even though at the same time infusions of energy. If in living in a house which is comfortable, functional, and becomes identified with a house, then there's the self-evaporation. Then one is that house, and one one needs to show it off or get a better one, because this one gets used to, it doesn't show one off enough. Self comes in whenever there is identity and idea and separation from everyone else through this identity and idea. And it has nothing to do anymore with surviving, living healthily and sanely. Sometimes in psychological theory, self is equated with the integration of everything that has happened, some integrating process. I don't really know what it means. Integrating what? All one's memories into a whole? That's not the intelligence we talked about before, which sees clearly what is going on and acts out of that clarity of seeing. Using memory when necessary, but not compelled by memory. Why are we so attached to this notion of self, that we have a self? Maybe the concern is not, do we need a self to survive? But the concern is, how can I make that self survive? I'm afraid of it. It's not surviving. I'm afraid of it's not continuing. Not being happy in the future. Not becoming what one would like to become. Becoming older, we talked about that. Always the concern over this psychological image entity. Not quite making it and constantly trying to patch it up, repair and maintain it. Why this attachment to this bunch of ideas, images, memories, and all the feelings that go with it? Why? Is it that we confuse it with this body, that we think this body is myself? We say that, it's my body. But we have to look at these things. Who is the owner of it? If we say, this is my body, and I want to keep it beautiful and slim and young. Who's saying that? Where do these words come from? From an entity, from a self? And if that's there, can I find it? Can I be in touch with it? Contact it? See it working? Or is all that I see when I look thoughts and ideas and feelings connected with them? The owner of this body, what is it but the thought that there is an owner? that there is a me. Do you see that? When you say it's me sitting here, that's a way of speaking. And it communicates something. This one is sitting here, and this one's sitting there and there. And we have different names, so we can talk to each other, not everybody answer at the same time. You feel depressed, and somebody asks you, where does the depression come from? You say, it comes from me. But what is that me, what the depression comes from? Or the fear comes from me. One can speak this way and allow these words to influence one in attachment and fear of loss, fear of continuity, or one can examine from how one speaks and not be satisfied with just one's manner of speaking, which is very superficial most of the time. We speak in ways that we don't examine where our words come from, what they refer to, what's their basis for using them, other than that we've always spoken like this before, and our parents too. Is this worthy of investigation? To find out what that me is and observe it in relationship? We've talked about it for 5 days. Something comes up within oneself, fear. Maybe we'll have an extra talk on fear. Fear comes up. Where did it come from? Not just say, I'm afraid, it's human nature. Can't do anything about it, everybody is afraid. Or it's primordial fear. Aren't we always in one way or other afraid for this self? Afraid it may not get its way, it may not get its due. It may not have pleasure. It may be cheated or crossed or die. If there was no feeling of self, if there was just the free functioning of this organism, seeing, hearing, eating, walking, working, pleasurably, painfully at times, would there be any fear? Or does fear come up when one imagines this won't last, or this will happen because it happened in the past, or because somebody said so or wrote so? Can there be freedom from fear as long as there is the conviction and attachment of self? Or is fear inevitable? We're just picking fear right now. Is fear inevitable as long as there's the feeling of self, the image of me, the idea of my future, the remembrance of my past? and the attachment to all of that. If it's seen as an image of me, a memory, a projection, it's seen to be an image, a projection, a memory, then why would there be fear? How can one fear for an image? If one is afraid that this organism will die, one has to imagine that to happen. There's also fear for an image. So one begin to see that how self, idea of self, attachment to self, has very little to do with survival, may actually endanger it, make it complicated, precarious. Problematical. We will end here for today.